I think one of the things about crime writing in particular is we're quite scared of tech, So we're always sort of, it really spoils a chase scene if you can just phone the police. Hello.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Edinburgh International Book Festival. I'm writer and broadcaster Sam Baker, and I am delighted to be here to introduce you to the inimitable Denise Mina. And I'm now going to make her cringe for the next 2 minutes. To say Denise is prolific is an understatement. Since her first book, Garnet Hill, was published in 1998, she has written 18 books, countless graphic novels, and several stage plays. She's the creator of the Garnet Hill trilogy, the Paddy Meehan series, and I know how much you love that because we've already got a question about that. The Alex Morrow series, and I'm not going to list all the awards that she's won because she'll get a really big head and that just would be unbearable. She was inducted into the Crime Writers Association Hall of Fame in 2014 and won both the Gordon Byrne Prize and the McIlvanny Prize for Scottish Crime Novel of the Year for her fictional true crime, The Long Drop. Conviction, her first novel featuring Anna McDonald, was a Reese Witherspoon Hello Sunshine Book Club pick and a Times Book of the Year. She's also started taking highly entertaining literary road trips with Frank Skinner. In her latest book, Confidence, we meet Anna again in a Euro crime romp for the internet age that has variously been compared to Hitchcock, Graham Greene, and Dan Brown for grown-ups, emphasis on the for grown-ups. That makes it sound great fun, and it really is. But true to form, Denise also addresses serious questions of faith, doubt, and ethics in a digital landscape. Denise and I are going to set the world to rights for about 45 minutes. Then we'll take audience questions. So if you're watching online, please post your questions as you think of them. At the end, Denise will be signing in the room straight across the hall over there. Welcome, Denise.
Hooray! Thanks, Sam.
So, start by telling us a bit about Confidence, about the story.
Well, it was written in lockdown, which I think you can tell because one of the wonderful things about being a writer is in lockdown I went to Rome and I went to Paris quite a lot. And when I was writing it, they sort of go on this chase over all the way across Europe. But it basically starts with, I came across these really strange videos that I didn't understand, and they were people breaking into houses and filming all the stuff that they'd found. And I thought, why are they doing that? Because surely they'll get done for burglary, and they were like a lot, but the houses were all abandoned, and they were just very, very strange, and they had tiny numbers as well. So it turns out this is urban exploring, and urban exploring is when people go into abandoned buildings, they explore the built environment, and they sort of document it. And there are lots of rules around it. So like very small, unseen communities often have very rigid rules that they have to kind of stick to, and they all fall out with each other. If there's like 3 people in a room, was it Brendan Behan said the first order of business in any campaign is a schism. So they're all really angry with each other, the urban explorers. And so they go into these buildings and they sort of document what they see. And I thought, wouldn't it be really amazing if somebody did that and found something amazing in one of these houses? Like if they broke into an abandoned house and they found a body, or they broke into an abandoned house. So the story is they're watching this film, and the person who's documenting themselves walking through this abandoned chateau, which was real, it was a real urban exploring film, and they banged against a wall and it opened, and they went in, and it was an uncharacteristic room, and inside the room was a silver casket, and it said on the silver sealed, and it said on the silver casket, there's proof in here of the crucifixion of Christ, and it belonged to Pontius Pilate. And then the person who's found it then goes missing, and the casket is up for auction in Paris. And so that was kind of the starting point, because I wanted a really, I think a lot of us felt this in lockdown. I wanted a really sort of, the stories I was enjoying were really escapist, you know? And I wanted to see all the things that we couldn't have, all the travel, all the just silly stories, people on planes, you know, like people talking to each other, more than 3 people in a room, luxuries like that.
Yeah, leaving the house more than once a day without having to get signed in and out, you know. But you'd already written Conviction, which features the same characters, which is a similar, not quite as Euro-rompy as Confidence, but it is similar. It's got that, you know, I hate to say Dan Brown because that makes immediate assertions, you know, let's call it Raiders of the Lost Ark more. It's got that vibe already. And that was actually quite an unfashionable style when you decided to resurrect it.
Yeah.
What was it that made you do that before you were locked down and were desperate to leave the house?
You know, I think one of the things about crime writing in particular is we're quite scared of tech, you know? So we're always sort of, you know, it really spoils a chase scene if you can just phone the police. Yeah. You know, I mean, lots of conventions that we have relied on.
That's why everything's set in the 1980s, isn't it? And earlier, no mobile phones.
No phones, do you know what I mean? And no DNA, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think, I thought, what if you just leaned into it? And another thing I'd noticed was the way we're receiving stories is very different now. So, for example, I'll sit and watch a box set and really, really enjoy it while scrolling on my phone, while, you know, also writing text to people or making jokes about things, or, you know, I'll text a friend and say, watch this, and we'll watch it together. And instead of being frightened of it, what would happen narratively if you used that sort of really kind of fractured narrative style? And one of the lovely things about, I think podcasts are amazing, I know you do, but one of the things I really love about podcasts is they go off on tangents. So there are little stories within stories, which is something you don't really often get that in, you know, characters in crime novels are interested in this one death. And then sometimes there'll be a backstory or a B story, but they don't have C, D, and E stories, which is the way we receive stories now. So I thought it would be great to do a really sort of fractured storytelling style. So, for example, in this one, they're on holiday in a lighthouse, and they're trapped in this. They've decided to go on a holiday with their extended family, with their blended family, so with their ex-partners and stuff like this. And then Americans find this hilarious because no one would do that. It's a mad thing to do. And it goes wrong, and they all hate each other, and they're all trapped in a lighthouse. Just the idea that stories are tangential, and that actually you're not really sure what all the strands are, but there's always a backstory to things, and it gave me a chance to basically tie lots of short stories together within that one kind of fractured narrative. But you know, it's really weird because I often write books that are a different form, and you know, they're really quite challenging, I think, are quite difficult. Or, not difficult, but they're not what you expect. I mean, you don't pick it up and you don't finish it and go, that was exactly like the last one, you know, to my publisher's dismay, to be perfectly honest.
I was going to say, your publishers must absolutely hate you, because whilst as a reader, there are some authors, not any that would be here or in Edinburgh, but there are definitely some where you read a book and you think, hang on, have I read that before?
Yep.
More or less, you've just changed the names. But you would never do that. Your publishers must go, please, Denise, please, just write something we recognise.
Well, a little bit, yeah.
I'm so glad you don't, though.
No, well, you know, what's the point? You know what I mean? Because I think, you know, being a writer is not easy, and I'm not saying it's terrible, but you know, we could all have done other things, and if you get the chance to do this, why not just really enjoy it? And do you know what I mean? And talk about the things you're interested in. And there is an amazing thing about coming across text that you actually use in a story, because it feels real. It feels like, oh, maybe this is a bit real. And then if you've got strands in that are a bit real, it really aids the suspension of disbelief, I think, for the reader.
I mean, you were a real podcast early adopter, weren't you? I mean, you've been into podcasts since way before everybody suddenly started listening to Serial. Do you think you could have written Confidence and its predecessor, Conviction, which I must just say that Confidence absolutely does read as a standalone. So if you haven't read Conviction, it doesn't really matter. Could you have written those books if podcasts hadn't existed, do you think?
Do you know, I could have, but I wouldn't have had the courage. Because listening to podcasts quite obsessively, I think it is a new narrative style. I do think it's a new narrative style. And I think it's, if you watch Murderers in the Building, Only Murderers in the Building, anybody watch that?
I love that.
I love that show. So that is like one take on it. But being a very early adopter, podcasts, true crime podcasts, they used to all slag each other off, and they used to say, this one covered this last week, but they made a real hash of it. Then they started having conferences, and they said, we met the people from that podcast at this conference, and they're actually really nice. And then they started doing joint podcasts. So it was like watching a civilization develop, you know what I mean? It was so weird. But I do think it is like a unique narrative style. The way you receive the story is somebody's whispering a story in your ear. Do you know what I mean? It's like a really strange thing. But what I was going to say was I quite often write books that are strange structurally, or are, just odd, or sort of, like I wrote one that was a discovered diary. And if it's received incredibly well in America, it's not received as well here very often. And the really weird ones are really well received in the States, whereas here, people like the more, and I don't know if it's just the way that I'm marketed. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if it's because over there people are expecting more literary stuff, or I don't know.
So for instance, would Long Drop be a Brit book?
Long Drop is absolutely a Brit book, and Long Drop, I won so many prizes for that. It was lauded, and I still meet people who are like, "Oh my God!" And in the States, it got slated. It got absolutely slated in the Kirkus review, and the review, it said something like, it's just full of cliches, and they didn't know it was non-fiction. They thought it was a fiction book. And it just did nothing. And I wrote a book which was a discovered diary called Sanctum, which over here, it was supposed to be somebody had thrown away a computer, and they'd been keeping a diary on it, and this was the diary being published. And over here, it was met with a kind of resounding meh. But in the States, it made my career. You know what I mean? But it's lovely because it's like a year later. So it feels kind of like no one loves my ugly baby. Oh, someone loves my ugly baby.
So Conviction was huge in the States, wasn't it? It was Reese Witherspoon, and you've sold the film rights. But I read, tell me if this is wrong, because quite often things you read on the internet are wrong.
What?
Who knew? Yeah. That Conviction actually sold more audiobooks than print books in the States?
Yes, it did. It did, yeah.
That is so interesting. Why do you think that was?
I think the way we are receiving stories is very different now. I think also reading is a luxury, because you need both hands, you need both eyes. And, if you're busy and you've got caring responsibilities and you've got stuff to do and you need to clean the house, if you can listen to a story, that's another thing about podcasts. I can actually, if I listen to one that I've listened to before, I remember where I was when I listened to it, and I remember the images I saw when I was listening to it previously. So I think it goes into a different bit of your brain. But it's like comics. I think you can feel your brain moving differently when you write comics, because you're using both hemispheres of your brain. And I think that's why, people who read comics are much more invested. Opinionated, obviously, or nuts. Because if you read comics, you get really crazy about comics in a way that I think, because books are older, they have a kind of gravitas to them, and you feel like you should be reading. You should, it's a self-improvement tool instead of just something that you do because you love it. You don't go to the toilet in a rubbish job and read a chapter to cheer yourself up. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. You read, and then you go to the book club, and then you opine, and
or you pretend you've read it. And
you pretend you've read it. You just read it, and you just say, "I thought it was rubbish." But Samuel Pepys was always swearing off the theatre because the theatre was new. you know,
Yeah.
when he was keeping his diaries and he was always saying,
This
you know,
newfangled thing.
it's so bad for you and it rots the brain, and now we force children to go to the theatre on the grounds that it will be good for them, you know. So I think audiobooks, I think they are books and it is the story, but you can use both hands at the same time. Do you know what I mean? So I do think people are realising that, and I think, you know, I wish people weren't intimidated by books, and I love it when I meet people. I mean, I live in Glasgow, so this happens to me quite often. I meet people and they say, I read your book and it was shit. That happened to me the other day at a funeral, actually.
Oh, thanks.
Somebody's mum said, I read The Long Drop. I thought it was rubbish. Hated it. Because she doesn't like swearing, so fair play. So for her, it was rubbish. It was absolute rubbish for her, because every time she came to a swear word, she was like, oh, you know, very jangled. And but I love that, because that means that people are reading books as if they have a right to have an opinion, and not as if they're doing it for an A-level exam. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I just wonder whether, I mean, podcasts are kind of a gateway drug to audiobooks. And I did wonder if one of the reasons that Conviction was an audiobook hit was because it's kind of, it's to get really meta about it, it's a book of a podcast in audio, whether it's like kind of going that extra. What is it about, because confidence takes that to the next level, it really is a book of a podcast or a podcast of a book of a podcast. Anyway, what does that format allow you to do that you might not otherwise be able to do?
I think when you spend far too much time on your own writing, which we both do, you think about the structure more than readers would. And when I read books that really shatter that structure, I find that really thrilling. You know, there's a writer called Jane Gardam who does amazing things in her writing. And then she wrote a series of books called Old Filth, which is about a barrister. And filth stands for failed in London, try Hong Kong. And they're really, really funny. And she feels utterly fearless. And then there's a bit when there are like barristers having a conversation, and she just goes into a script for like it's in the format of a script, which is exactly what it should be, because they are performing for one another and they are delivering lines to one another. And, you know, I mean, I've read her and I've actually shut the book and thought, you can't do that. And then opened it again and thought, but she has, and it works. You know, so I mean, that's the sort of thing I find really thrilling. A writer like Bulgakov, his books should not work. Structurally, they should not work. And because of that, you're wrong-footed, you know? So in crime novels, the pending question is always, who is the murderer? Or why did they do that? But if you can also add in a pending question about the structure, like, is this writer going to be able to pull this off? Why are they telling it in this way? Then I think that adds extra impetus to the storytelling, you know?
Yes, Confidence is a very plotty book, isn't it? I mean, it's like plotted to the nth degree. Can you be too intricate in your plotting?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this book might be a bit too intricate. And I think, because I think when you're sitting and you're focusing on something and you're thinking, well, 150 pages ago he said he had a hat, so when they see the hat, they're obviously going to know that. So I think you can be too intricate in plotting, and I think you can become obsessed with plotting and think about it too much and forget that actually what the audience really wants is to be in the company of the characters in the story. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so
totally.
I thought that when people read Confidence, they would say, what an amazing plot, you really answered every question. But what people are actually saying is, Bram's brilliant, he's so rude to everybody. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
So you forget that when you're writing it, because you just think you've got these characters and, you know, how can you make it make sense? How can you give the reader a payoff to every single question in the story? And also, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't plot. So I'm a pantser. That's what that's called.
Yeah.
Like you,
I was going to
do it by the
ask
seat
you.
of your
I
pants.
thought you were, yeah.
So what I do is I sort of write the first act and then try and work out what the questions are and then try and answer the questions.
Hang on, so you did Confidence by the seat of your pants?
Totally by the seat of my pants.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, if you haven't read it, read it, and then I trust you're going to be, what?
Yeah.
What?
It was lockdown. We were all mad.
Yeah, God. Oh my God, I thought you had one of those walls with post-it notes, string and
No.
No?
I just had pajamas covered in egg and, and a bit of a breakdown maybe.
So you said Confidence started with the urbexers, the urban explorers. But did it start, I mean, it started with that, but what was next then? Was it the character that was next for you? Was it Anna? Was it?
It was Anna and Finn, first of all. And also, I always conceived of Conviction being a series. Because,
you did? Okay, so
because
that's,
podcasts, always go on for a second series and sometimes a third. But there's a brilliant podcast called The Accused. And at the end of the first season, they said, it was just really beautiful, and it was a forgotten cold case that nobody cared about, and it was somebody with no children, and it was 30 years ago, and they convicted the wrong man very obviously. And at the end of the first season, they said, now, if you have a case that you would like us to investigate, please write to us. But they'd obviously recorded it before it became really big, and it was being recommended by everybody. And then they came back for the second season, and they were clearly just swamped by people writing to them. And they're really thoughtful women. It was two women, really thoughtful, caring women. And they'd obviously been swamped by all these letters from people who'd experienced tragedies and felt there was no justice. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
Because I don't think anybody involved in podcasting thought it was going to be a living even. Do you know what I mean?
No,
I don't think
absolutely.
nobody knew how you were going to monetize it.
And especially those, and many still don't, I think, but especially those early days when it really was amateurs. It really was the kind of only murders in the building scenario where a bloke got his mic out and was like, who killed Bunny?
Yeah.
It really was that situation.
Yeah.
So you always conceived of it being a series, and was Finn always going to be in the series, or did he just refuse to leave?
No, I think Finn, I realise whenever I finish a book, I always think, I've just written the same book again. Because there's always a male friend, always. And there's always a male friend who's slightly sexless and the woman explains things to. And I keep thinking, so
That is, put it like that, that is true.
It is true. It is true. And so Finn, I think Finn was always going to be there. And I think also, he has anorexia. And I think, a lot of people spoke to me about the experience of reading someone who has anorexia in a story, and their anorexia isn't solved at the end, which, because it is an ongoing condition that people live with. So I really wanted him to recur as a character and be somebody who lives and thrives and still has anorexia and deals with his condition, and he finds different ways to do that. And I think that's, you really don't see models of that in narrative.
No, and you, particularly not men,
No.
but also not women.
Yeah. So, a lot of people who have that condition contacted me and said, that it was really lovely to see that, to see somebody struggling with their eating, and for them to be a character and for them to have other stuff going on, obviously being crisis, but for it not to be, because if it's a woman, her anorexia, I don't know if you've noticed this trend, is usually solved by getting the right boyfriend.
Yeah. Everything if you're a woman, is usually solved by getting the right boyfriend.
Yeah. So Finn was always going to be in there, and also he's the only one who knows how to work the machines. She doesn't really know what she's doing, so he's quite important.
So tell the audience a bit more about Anna and Finn for the people who haven't read Conviction.
Okay, so Anna's a very rude woman, and she's very. It was really funny when I was going around promoting it. Quite often I would be cheered by guys, and if I was being cheered by a man, I knew they were going to say, "I hate that character," because she's very rude and she's very brisk. But women love her,
Yeah,
and I think she says a lot of the things that people are thinking. So Finn has if you have the experience of being friends with someone who has an eating problem and you don't have an eating problem, she says all the things that you're not supposed to say, like shut up and eat your dinner, and you're eating more than that, and stuff like that. So she is a woman who is living. I'll just tell you, assuming that you've read Conviction. She's someone who doesn't want to be pictured. She's leading a secret life, and she is a survivor of a sexual assault by footballers many years ago. And I always wondered what happened to those women. You know, those women who were raped in hotel rooms, and then their name was leaked. And then they were doxxed. And I thought, you know what happened? It actually came from Trump, when Trump was elected. While the night he was elected, or the day after he was elected, a woman who said that she'd been raped by him when she was 13 dropped her case and disappeared. And I always wondered what happened to her, and that was really who I was thinking about, was these people whose lives are changed. Anyway, so she's off. She's changed her name and she's living a sort of secret life. And obviously she doesn't want to be in the public eye. So in this book, she's living as a known survivor of sexual abuse. But that's very different now than it was when those books came out, you know, because when Conviction came out, it was before the Me Too movement, really.
Yeah, a lot's changed.
Yeah, a lot has changed.
Then.
And actually, you know, we talk about all the things that are wrong, but things have changed so fundamentally over the past even 6 years. It's fantastic. Do you know what I mean? It is fantastic.
Totally.
I mean, I don't think she would necessarily be believed now because there's a lot of money in it. But if you look at the Ryan Giggs case,
but just finally come through.
How different would that have been 10 years ago?
Well, it's not so long ago, on the subject of Ryan Giggs, that, you know, he was able to get an injunction to stop journalists saying he was having affairs. And, you know, he's just stood in court and said, you know, I've never been faithful in a relationship, ever. But, you know, only 5 years ago, he could get an injunction.
Exactly.
So that's a huge matter. I was looking back at your work earlier, and sexual assault and what makes a good victim versus a bad victim is something that comes up again and again and again in your work. And whilst it's not a dominant theme in Confidence, it's still there because of Anna and her children.
You're
ultimately.
Right, because actually that is what the story is about, is the fact that no one's looking for the girl who found the box. Everyone's looking
for
the box.
Yeah.
So so Gabby Petito, I don't know if you remember that case, that was happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So the Gabby Petito case was a girl she'd been traveling around in a van with her boyfriend, and then she disappeared. He'd arrived home with the van, and she was nowhere to be seen. Nobody knew where she was. And that was solved by people on the internet saying, the police released a bit of video of she was sobbing in the van, and the boyfriend was saying she's just a bit mad, and somebody had phoned the police because they'd seen them fighting, and actually he'd murdered her. And they found her body because people in RVs had filmed the road and they'd spotted the van being stopped somewhere, and that's how they found the body. So it is about, you know, I mean, I think a lot of the themes in a lot of my books are about victims and good victims and bad victims. And in this particular book, it's about, you know, finances. Like, if there's enough money in it, no one's going to care about the victim. You know, where is she? Nobody cares, you know.
And that's still very much the case, isn't it? I mean, one of the dominant themes in this book is about the ethics of podcasts, the ethics of storytelling, and I know that you're really fascinated in the ethics of true crime, if you like. What are the particular problems that you think that throws up?
True crime stories, telling true crime stories.
Yeah, and the podcast.
Well, I mean, early doors in podcasting, it was just cowboy country. So people were saying, you know, this man is an innocent victim. He hasn't murdered anybody. But I'll tell you who did do it. John, that lives at number 10. And then gangs of angry people were turning up outside number 10 and attacking John. And so, I mean, I think very obviously, you know, but you know, with the best will in the world, sometimes they were right. It was John at number 10. And John at number 10 shouldn't have been going on about his life. But you know, you have to, I think there are always consequences that you can't foresee in these things. And I think true crime podcasting, I mean, you know, I love true crime. And I love the form of true crime, and I even like badly written true crime. Whenever I used to do like a North American tour, I would always buy myself a really badly written true crime book at the end, and I would go for a high tea in a hotel in whichever city I was in.
You buy it in Duane Reade.
Yeah,
one of those spinners.
Or Walgreens, yeah.
Yes.
And I would sit and read it, and I would feel like a really good writer because it was so badly written. And sometimes, I mean, if there are any writers in the room, sometimes if I'm feeling really underconfident, I screenshot really badly written things, and I just read over them. It just makes you feel great about your work. I think, well, I wouldn't have used 20 commas in a sentence anyway. But you know, I think true crime is where crime fiction comes from. And we really want there to be a distinction, you know? We really want there to be a distinction between crime fiction and true crime. True crime's dirty, true crime's a low art form. When I started writing crime fiction, it was a low art form. And, you know, a lot of festivals, the Edinburgh International Festival is very different, but a lot of festivals wouldn't have you if you were a crime fiction writer.
Yeah,
and that's why crime fiction has a lot of festivals, because we weren't invited to anything else, because it was a really, really dirty, low-down thing to write about. And unless it was like Lord Peter Wimsey or, you know, you were Agatha Christie, but even she's kind of looked down on as kind of, and then, you know, sort of in the 25 years since I've been writing, people do PhDs on it, it's taken very seriously, so it's been elevated up, like comics, actually. Comics used to be, when I started writing comics...
Incredible art form now, aren't they?
Yeah,
it's graphic novels, not comics.
That's right, I just say comics. But, you know, people thought I was writing them as an aid to literacy for people who couldn't read. I was like, it's Hellblazer, I'm not, do you know what I mean? Or they thought, you know, that, you know, it's for people who couldn't handle a full book, or they thought I was doing it for money, which no one is writing comics for money, I can promise you that. But that has, and that is money. That is because there's a lot of money in Marvel and all that kind of thing, and DC franchises and all that sort of thing.
Most of that doesn't go to the illustrators and the story writers, though.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. No, but. You know, I think true crime is kind of having a moment, but I mean, it is perennial, the interest in true crime stories. And just because you're reading it in the Telegraph doesn't mean you're not reading a true crime story. You're still reading a true crime story. You know, I mean, I think if you listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, they're always saying, you know, they're always being asked in interviews, true crime is having a moment. It's not having a moment. It's always been there. You just haven't been paying attention, you know?
It's just become something that you're allowed to admit to liking now. And really,
yes, I mean, some of it's very good. Some of it's very well, it's terribly well done.
Some of it even gets published in quite a posh way now.
Yes, yeah. You know, I mean, I've done an essay on the history of true crime stories, and it actually started off with what, you know, in Oliver, who will buy this wonderful morning, there's a man in the background with a baffling sort of Vichy cross and papers over it, and he's dancing about, and everybody knows what eggs are and flowers are, but nobody really knows what that guy's doing. Well, what that guy is doing is selling true crime stories. Yes, because what they used to do was the guy would go to a printer's and they would say, oh, you know, a young woman has been found murdered in Battersea, and you know, she was very virtuous. And they sort of banged out all
back to the good victim there.
Back to the good victim. All the cliches are in those stories if you look at those old pamphlets. And they worked out that these sold like hotcakes, right? So they sold tons and tons. So the printer would print it out, and then they would get the sheets, and then they would go off and sell them. And then they developed what is called a cock. And a cock is a false true crime story that will sell like hotcakes, and then they can write another one and say, oh, it turned out that didn't really happen, and people will buy that as well to find out what actually happened. But people have always been interested in these stories, and like Edgar Allan Poe is always credited as creating crime fiction, but actually the Murder of Marie Roget is a rewriting of a true crime story, and he was a journalist, he was a newspaperman, so he would have covered this. It was a woman went for a day out in New York. She went off to, I think it was Long Island, and she was killed, and it was very mysterious, so he made her French, and wrote it as a crime fiction thing and invented crime fiction. So true, I mean, it's true, you know, it all comes from true crime. And if you say to the reader, this is true crime, you can make it not believable because real life is not believable. In the fiction, everything has to be believable.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It is crazy. It has to make sense. Do you know what I mean? Otherwise, the reader will say, well, you know, why has he got 17 cars? That doesn't make any sense. Well, sometimes people just have 17 cars for no reason. Do you know what I mean? So it gives you sort of license to tell a madder story about real people. I mean, I don't know about you, but as I get older, I used to put my friends in my books, and none of them are believable anymore. They're all ridiculously eccentric and like concentrated versions of themselves. Do you know what I mean?
It's like that thing when your editor comes back to you with like, well, that wouldn't happen and that wouldn't happen. And you're like, it did.
It did happen.
It did, actually.
Yeah, it did,
It's like that. Are you tempted to write? I know everybody is always saying to you, do another long drop, Denise. And I'm not going to say that. But are you tempted to do not another long drop, but another revisit true crime, do another exploration?
Well, I wouldn't say no. I've actually, I'm trying to, well, I have done.
You've done? Is that the next one?
No, it's not a book, it's a sort of novella, and it's about
That's a book.
It's a book.
Just a smaller book.
Do you know, we have to call them novellas for publishing reasons, but they're just like short stories.
What Rizzio length?
Rizzio length, yeah. A bit longer than that. Yep.
Exciting. Can you tell us a bit more?
But, well, can I? I don't know. I didn't read the contract, and I think it says that you mustn't tell anybody
give us
anything.
Some more hints.
All right, all right, okay.
Just a bit more.
So I'm developing this series of true crime stories written by writers who write in other forms.
So exciting.
I know. So I'll just tell you. Anyway, I wrote this story about a guy called Alberto Nisman, which happened in Buenos Aires. So
that's
do you know
why
this
you were
story?
in Buenos Aires.
That's why I was in Buenos Aires. Yeah. Right. So shall I tell you a story?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
Yes.
This is covered by an NDA, by the way, so I shouldn't really tell you a story, but
yeah,
it's
so
just
you'll all
such a
be
good
shot
story.
at the door.
I'm just thinking about it. Okay, so Alberto Nisman, when I started researching this, I thought he was gay because he's had quite a lot of plastic surgery. But when you go to South America, men all have plastic surgery.
We don't subscribe to stereotypes here.
No, but they have. He looks like he's had quite a lot of, anyway. So he was found shot with a single bullet in a locked bathroom in his locked apartment in the middle of Buenos Aires in a very secure building. But the next day he was due in Parliament and he was presenting a report that accused the president of corruption to a degree that would have meant that the president went to prison. And he was very excited about this and he'd been working on it for 5 years. And he had apparently committed suicide. So that's all I'm going to tell you. So that's the starting point of it. So I went out to Argentina and went full Perry Mason on it. Anyway, it's not going to be out for 2 years, but when it comes out, you can say, "Oh, I already know that story." But it's absolutely amazing. So people in Argentina, because of the history of Argentina, became convinced he'd been murdered. And there was a gigantic march of millions of people marching through Buenos Aires with signs saying, "I am Alberto Nisman," because if it can happen to him, it can happen to anybody. And then they discovered that there was a secret compartment in the bathroom that you get into.
Like
Sam,
Only Murders in the Building.
Exactly like that. That's exactly what I was thinking about. Yeah. There was a secret compartment in the bathroom that you could get into another part. Also, that night, he had dismissed his security detail, or his security detail had been pulled off the building, and the CCTV in the building had been anyway. But it's just like, but he was also Jewish, and one of the things about Argentina, I don't know if you know this, but at the end of the Second World War, the Vatican, a lot of Nazis went and hid in the Vatican, in Vatican City. And they were given passports in exchange for money, Vatican City passports, and they went to South America. So there were a lot of Nazis funding Argentina under the Perons, and so there is a lot of Nazism there. It's not even like alt-right. They're not even dressing it up with a different name. There's a lot of Nazism there. So there was graffiti all over Buenos Aires after Nisman was killed that said, the only good Jew is a dead Jew. Nisman is a good Jew. So, I mean, it was a huge, I mean, it just went into the whole history of anti-Semitism in South America, which is something we really don't think about or talk about, what happened to all those people out there, you know? What is it like to live in and the history of Argentina is so interesting because, you know, people fleeing pogroms went to Argentina. There was just nothing, you know, there were no cities or anything like that. So a huge Jewish diaspora went out there. They went to the country, they built up these huge pampas rancheros and made a lot of money. So they all live around the city and own all the land and are very rich because they went out there because they didn't want to be murdered. And then 50 years later, there was an influx of Italian syndicalists. Do you know what syndicalists are?
Tell us.
Mick Lynch is people who believe in unions, right? That workers just shouldn't work for peanuts and die at their job. So they all moved out there, but they are anarcho-syndicalists.
Yeah.
So they believe that if the RMT don't get the deal that they're pushing for, they should blow people up. So they were quite, you know, quite intense. So the cities are all anarcho-syndicalists and communists, and all around it there's a huge Jewish, and then all these Nazis come over after the war. So it's quite the powder keg. And they're living with the consequences of that. But I mean, it's so interesting to go somewhere that has such a different history. You know, it is our history, but it's like somebody shook up all the bits and threw the dice, and they all come out in a different way, you know?
I saw you'd been out there, and I was going to ask you if you were actually going to make a podcast, because I did wonder what you were, some things, she's up to something out there.
Yeah,
totally.
no, I was up to something,
Thank
yeah.
You absolutely love research, don't you?
Oh my God, yeah, I love it.
How do you stop yourself going like right down a rabbit hole and never coming back up again?
Well, I'll tell you how you do that. You work out what your questions are before you go to look. Otherwise, you will just do research for the rest of your life on one book. And you have to be very disciplined about it. And Glasgow, Strathclyde Police used to have this media department, and I became quite good friends with the guy who ran the media department. So I would go with 50 questions, but my rule was they had to be yes, no answers, because he was as chatty as I was. So, you know, I'd be there for 2 hours, and I would come away, and I'd think, that's only one question. Do you know what I mean? So I think you have to be very, very disciplined about it. And then when you're editing, you have to cut out the bits that don't fit into the story, because sometimes you come across absolutely amazing stories. Although in Conviction and Confidence, actually you can just put them in, because it is all fractured. Do you know what I mean? So there's a whole bit in Confidence about where urban exploring came from, and you know, where this idea of enjoying the built environment as if you were entitled to be there came from. And it all really came from one guy called Gary Warren, and he was part of this movement in San Francisco, and that's actually where Burning Man came from. And they were, you know, they were all communists, and they were all, you know, socialists, and they were all about reclaiming the city and everything. And now you have to pay like $1,000 to go to Burning Man,
and the rest,
and the rest,
and it's all, you know, Mark Zuckerberg and his mates. Isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's one of the things I think that's really interesting about utilising the podcast format in fiction, is that you can do what would rudely be called an info dump in a standard fiction format. And, you know, in a podcast, it's just information, and you're just delivering more information, and you're not saddled by that show don't tell thing.
What is that about?
Crime fiction is.
I love an info dump. I love a story that tells you something about something else.
Yeah, you learn something about a thing that's happening.
In a story, I love that. You know, I really love it when someone tells you about something and isn't just showing you that they did an English literature degree. I don't care. Do you know what I mean? I remember someone said about very unkindly, they said about Morrissey, this was before Morrissey was a racist, they said he's read the books and Lloyd Cole has read the reading list. You know?
Yeah.
I don't want your reading list. Do you know what I mean? I want to know what you've found out about it while you were digging into all of this, you know?
The questions are pouring in online now. So what I will do is I will take a question from online first, and then if we could put the lights up a bit. If you've got a question for Denise, can you put your hand up, and then the roving mics will come to you, and I'll alternate between you guys and online. So a lot of Rizzio fans in the audience online, I don't know about here, but probably here too. Do you plan to write another book like Rizzio?
Do I? Yes. So at the moment, there's a thing on Radio 4, and it's an episodic history of Savonarola. It's called Three Fires. You can listen on BBC Sounds. So that's a shorter version of a long Savonarola book that I'm writing. And basically, Savonarola is always told in conjunction with the Medici because they were so intertwined. But actually, Savonarola is a fascinating character in and of himself, and he really started the Reformation. So because I did Rizzio, I became very interested in where all these ideas came from. And he basically staged a revolution in Florence and set up a republic. And he did very good things, like he extended the franchise, built the Great Hall in Florence, which a lot of people have seen. He commissioned that. He also made sodomy illegal. Most people have heard of the Bonfire of the Vanities, but they don't really know what it is. He was basically the Taliban. He basically radicalized small children and got them to go around attacking people, and was very angry. So Savonarola, Three Fires is the next Rizzio one. But I would have done Scottish stories, but I couldn't because Rizzio is part of the Darkland series, and Jenny Fagan's done one, Alan Warner's doing one, and I would just have looked like I was just trying to steal everybody's thunder if I did another Scottish one. Yeah.
So what's next then? So you've got the one you've just been telling us about, the Argentinian one, that one. What are we getting next?
What are you getting next?
I don't know how you keep all this stuff in your head, honestly.
It's just blind panic, Sam. It's just blind panic. The next thing that you're getting is what I'm currently writing, which is a Philip Marlowe book for the Chandler estate. Oh, no.
Oh, God.
Can we just take a minute and say your life? Do you know what I mean? Yeah, so I'm in the middle of doing that at the moment.
Have we got any questions in the auditorium? No? Really?
Very shy.
Oh, well.
Who's the gentleman here?
I've got lots here, so don't feel the pressure.
Do you think, in conviction, that Anna had a view of football players which was a bit like the previous generation's view of American soldiers in World War II? One, they were over here. Two, they were oversexed. And three, they were overpaid.
Yes. I think that's a good analogy. I think you're absolutely right, yeah. And I think, I'm not interested. Are you a football fan? I'm not really a football fan, so to me it's all baffling. In fact, I congratulated somebody on the women's team winning whichever cup it was, and they said, yeah, I'm a Scottish person. I don't give a fuck about that. But I think that was like in the 90s, that was a real kind of thing. I think it's a bit different. I think it's a bit different now because of women's football, because it seems a bit more, approachable. It seems a lot more international. And actually, I think players taking the knee, for me, kind of changed the way I felt about them. I felt a bit more respect for them. Do you know what I mean? Because I thought, well, these are not just people trying to make as much money as they can so they can live in ghastly houses. They're actually people who are experiencing, do you know what I mean? It's kind of humanized them a bit. So I think it's changing now, but I think when I wrote that book, definitely, yeah.
Thank you. Anne is asking, she says, I'm intrigued by the difference between reading stories and listening to stories. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I love reading a story, but I'm very aware that I will skive my work. And if I'm really enjoying a book, do you know what I mean? I will cancel things to stay home and finish the book. And so, you know, it is a real luxury activity, sitting reading. And when I'm listening to a story, I can do other things. Like I can get to places. I can, so it's not just, it is more convenient, but I feel as if my brain is working in a different way, you know? And I can tell, when I'm reading something, I can tell if it's working because I'm intrigued. But if I'm listening to a story, I can tell it's not working because I'm not listening anymore. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's, you know, that's really powerful storytelling if you can't stop listening to it, you know? Or if you're sitting in a car and you just stay there to listen to the end to find out what happened.
Yeah, there's a scene, I think actually it's in Conviction, where, you know, Anna is just standing in the hall with her coat on, listening to the podcast, and she's still there half an hour later because she's still listening, and I could just imagine that was you.
Yes. Yeah, that's often me, yeah.
Do you think that that's also brought about that we're seeing a bit of a resurgence in the storytelling as an oral tradition?
I mean, I think crime fiction does come from an oral storytelling tradition. I think we tend to think of the printed page as being all there is. And I think we're slightly too reverent about books. I do. And I think, you know, at the end of Savonarola's life, he was burned and they broke up all his bones and they put all the remains in a wheelbarrow and they threw it in the river because they didn't want anyone to have relics of his body because they thought this would keep the memory of him going. But the printing press was invented like 10 years later. And I think the printing press and books are the relics of today.
Yeah,
and I think we think of them as magical. We think of them as, you know, containing a power. We think of them as containing the essence of a person. And they don't. They're just a way of communicating, you know?
Yeah.
I'm at the Edinburgh Book Festival and I'm slagging off books. So that's great.
Yeah, and she actually wants you to go and buy one after
Yeah,
this too.
that's right, yeah.
But it's true, because I think we do, you know, people who would say they're not people who buy stuff, they're not materialists, they don't have objects, but they do have a house full of books, and that's okay.
And actually, if you've ever tried to cull your books, which you must have done, if you've ever tried to get rid of books, I mean, it is physically painful. Because you feel like you are losing that part of your life and your connection with that writer. And I mean, I think we imbue them with kind of spiritual, you know, like the Kindle distinction. They're really convenient, but I still want the physical thing. It doesn't feel real to me. It doesn't feel like I've really experienced it. If you think about things like, you know, in horror, the Necronomicon, the idea that there is a book so dangerous that, you know, I mean, it's such a narrative convention, the idea that there's a book that's so dangerous it will actually eat your hand off. You know, but I mean, that is like a transference of, you know, kind of religious belief into the printed word.
Are there any more questions on the floor? Thank you.
Everyone's bold now because you asked a question.
I loved your series with Frank Skinner.
Oh,
I thought
thank
it felt
you.
like you'd just found a place for yourself that really worked. And I just wonder if you've any plans to do more television, if there's something you'd like to do, perhaps.
Well, Frank and I are setting off in about 4 weeks to do another one. And yeah, I know, yeah. And they're just such a joy to do those things, you know. Yeah, so we're doing another one. And that's going to take about 3 weeks. We call ourselves Dank. So it's Denise and Frank. And we're always trying to find, and actually a lot of the things that the funniest moments get cut out because it's usually me swearing or one of us falling over or whatever, you know. But they're just an absolute joy. And we didn't know each other when we started doing that. We just did Boswell and Johnson as a kind of, you know, we met in Johnson's house. And after about 3 minutes, Frank said to the producer, I think we're not going to attack each other. I think you can leave us alone. But just, you know, what a lovely guy and what an interesting man. And they get you incredible access because if you say to people, we've got a camera, they let you go into graves, let you go anywhere. You know what I mean? So we've had absolutely brilliant adventures. But so we're starting another one. We're doing Pope and Swift, who are very great friends. And it's all about bitterness, and it's all about, you know, how you can survive this life without everyone hating you, and satire, and I mean, it's a completely different kind of milieu to talk about, and the history in the world and all that kind of thing. So, yeah.
I feel like I need to ask you David's question, because this question has been here since before we even started. Apparently he's an old hack, and he wants to know if there'll be another Paddy Meehan.
Oh, yeah, there are. There's going to be 2 Paddy Meehans. As you can tell, I'm quite busy at the moment, but there are supposed to be 2 more Paddy Meehans.
You're a workaholic, Denise.
But I'm not actually. I mean, I do really love working, but I'm really desperate for some time off. But just when you get the chance to do these things, do you know what I mean?
Totally.
And also, I'm 55, and you feel like I'm not going to do this forever. I mean, I still want to set up a sweet shop. That's my long-term plan.
Can I just say, it's Denise's birthday on Sunday. So like
56?
Yeah.
They said it wouldn't happen.
So 2 more Paddy Meehan, but they're a little bit down the line.
Well, so much has happened. But so much has happened. I mean, you couldn't not write those books. You couldn't not write those books because so much. The phone hacking has broken since then. And the whole history of newspapers and the demise of newspapers, I'm really just waiting for Murdoch to go on fire. And then that'll be my finale, you know. But it would have been so different if I hadn't left that hiatus. But there are 2 more, so it's supposed to be 5 altogether. There's only 3 out so far.
Brilliant. Any more from the floor? No?
This lady tentatively put her hand up.
There's a tentative one? No?
No?
No.
There's
okay.
one there.
One
do that
down
again. Oh. And then we'll come to you.
So just a quick one. Have you ever thought about doing a radio play or a radio series?
Oh, interesting. Well, so Three Fires is a radio series, but it's a story, you know, read out on over 5 nights, Sunday nights, prime time, at 7 o'clock on Radio 4, and it's called Three Fires. And I also wrote a radio play called Hurtle, which was about people trapped in a lift. But it wasn't very good. I'll be honest, it wasn't very good. But that was a long time ago. But I love radio. I really love radio. I'd love to do that.
Sorry. My question is, what I loved about the Paddy Meehan series was showing the Irish kind of Catholic perspective, working class. I'm Irish, lived in Scotland for about 10 years now, and I didn't know the extent of what those people suffered. And you write about it so eloquently, and I like the fact that in the Alex Morrow series, you did almost the Protestant experience. How did you do your background research for that? Because some of the stories are just so maybe unbelievable.
Well, I've 70 cousins, if that tells you anything. So I didn't really do anything, and I'm going to like 6 funerals next week. So there you are. So my family are Irish, and my grandfather came here when he was supposed to be 12. I don't know if it was in 1914 and he was 12, or if he was in 1914 and he was 14. I don't know. But he came over to work in the coal mines out in Motherwell. And then never spoke about being Irish, did not want to be involved in any of it. In fact, he had 15 kids, and they didn't really realise he was Irish until they phoned home. Because then he would say, Rutherglen 664. And they were like, God, he sounds mad. But anyway, so very Irish Catholic background. And, you know, it's so interesting how unassimilated we are. Really. Do you know what I mean? It's a very unspoken thing. I walk into a room, if you come from a very big family, you walk into a room with your arms open and a story, because that's what you have to do to get attention. And basically, everywhere in Scotland, apart from Glasgow, you just look drunk. And do you know what I mean? And I'm always the one with the loudest laugh in the room, and I'm always the one who's like, right, come on, everybody. Do you know what I mean? Let's breed like rats. Let's all live in one house, do you know? And so it's a very different culture. And a very storytelling culture, and the clock's just gone to 000. But anyway, I didn't do any research. I just stole my family's lives.
Oh yeah, it's not flashing us. It
Does it have to flash?
has in the past flashed at us and told us off because we've run over.
Let's do another one then. Fuck it, come on.
Girl, so it's not me, it's her. Are there any more questions? Before we start breaking the rules, let's make sure we're breaking the rules for a reason. No? Well, I have got one more online, and I feel a bit bad that they're being left out, so we'll just quickly ask this one. Julie wants to know why do you think more crime fiction hasn't been set in South America?
Actually, there are amazing crime fiction writers in America. Claudia Perron is a fantastic writer, and they just don't get translated. That's the reason, is they don't get translated because it's expensive. So, for example, in France, if your book is more than 250 pages, the translator gets double the amount. Oh, look, they're doing it with the lights. The translator they just get brighter and brighter until our eyes melt. So there are always pragmatic reasons, but there is a fantastic tradition of crime fiction in South America. It just doesn't really get translated over here very often.
And last one, give us a true crime podcast recommendation.
Oh, God. I love
Or
this.
5,
There's this brilliant one called Small Town Murder. Oh, it's flashing now.
There we go.
Small Town Murder, which is like 3 hours long, and they've copped onto the fact that it's too long, so they do a Saturday one called Small Town Murder Express, which is only an hour. But it's chef's kiss, it's brilliant.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Denise, for being so indiscreet, breaking your NDA. A reminder that Denise will be signing those books that she thinks you shouldn't be buying over the other side of the hall after this. But thank you for being absolutely brilliant.
Oh, Sam, thank you so much. Thank you very much.